Hi everyone, Nikki here again, and very excited to have our next week of lessons. So we're up to week 4. Well done for people that are still with us, and we're so excited to see similar names and new people joining every week. Today I have a very interesting, exciting opportunity for you. You are going to start to write your own stories. But before we do that, I wanted to start with a tiny little story here, a funny little story by my 8-year-old grandchild. Now, I've put her story on the left side, and you can see it is filled with mistakes, but I've put the correct version on the right side. So I'm going to read you the story. Once there was a little girl named Bob. She was 8 years old. She lived in a little cottage in Tasmania. Next. One night she went to bed and then she heard a bang at the door. She slowly crept up to the door. It opened with a loud creak. Standing there was a scallywag. He took Bob and ran. They were both never seen again. So I've put a few little notes here for meanings. So cottage is a little house. Tasmania is a state in Australia. Scallywag is a person who behaves badly or mischievously, or he can be a bit of a rascal. Anyway, I wanted to say to you, have a look at this child's story. It's very simple. You are all going to be able to write much more complex, interesting stories than this, because this child is only 8 years old. But if you look at her version on the left, it's full of mistakes. She has no full stops. She has no capital letters. She has no punctuation at all, except for an exclamation mark. Lots of spelling mistakes. It doesn't matter. It's good in a way that she's made those mistakes because a teacher can correct them. And I wanted to say that's something that you need to think about when you're writing things for me or for other of the other teachers to mark. It's important to make mistakes, and it doesn't matter. We are in a safe learning space. There are no consequences except to learn from our mistakes. We have no judgment, we have no punishments, and it's much better to make a mistake, lots of mistakes or some mistakes that we can see and help you, than to just copy something from the internet, and we can't really help you with that because that's not maybe your work, and there are no mistakes to correct. So anyway, I just wanted to say that about mistakes, but also have a look at this story because we'll come back to it when we're talking about other things later. So now we're coming to what you're going to be doing. I want you to tell me a story. Every one of us is a storyteller. So I want us to write and publish our stories. So for the next few weeks, not just quickly in 1 week, for a few weeks, this is a project. You are going to write your own story. You can write a story about anything that you want. Your story can be any length. You will need to work on your story over a few weeks. It's not a quick thing. You will need to write a few drafts of your story. I'll mark the drafts and I will send you the corrected copies. When your story is ready to be published, we will include it in a collection of stories which will be published on our website. Next. So what kind of story are you going to write? There are many genres. There are many types of stories. You could maybe write a horror story. In some ways, the little story written by that 8-year-old girl about Bob is a bit of a horror story, you know. They're taken away at the end. They never come back. There's a scallywag. So that explores fear. Crime and mystery. All of you will have seen some movies that have got crime, mystery stories in it. There's often a character that's going to solve the crime. That's a very common genre. Love and romance, also common. I'm sure all of you have seen a lot of movies, read a lot of books with love stories, romantic relationships, and often the couple in that story must overcome obstacles before they can find their happy ending. So that's that next genre. You could do science fiction genre, which is how science and technology affect the future. Your characters can include aliens or robots or AI artificial intelligence. You could do fantasy fiction story. Fantasy stories involve magical elements. Sometimes they're a bit taken from fairy stories or folk stories, or mythology. Harry Potter is a fantasy fiction, which is mixed with a bit of real life. The next one is modern real life stories. Now, real life stories are probably my favorite because they're inspired by actual situations, by problems, by events that happen in real life. So things that might have happened to you, you don't want to write it as this happened to me, but you might have a character that experiences something the same. So these are some genres that you could think about for your story. This one is, the next one is, if you can't think of an idea for your story, don't worry. I have got some ideas to help you, but I would like you to try and think of your own original idea, because that's going to be a lot more interesting for us to read. But here are some ideas. You could think of a big problem or a situation that you or someone you know had to face. Then you could write a story in which your character in your story is faced with that situation or battles with that problem. And you could create a story around that. That would be a real life kind of story. Here, the next one is a little scenario. A man pushes past your character in a crowd. After he is gone, she discovers her cell phone is missing. She calls her own number and the man answers. She asks the man to send her cell phone back to her. He hangs up. Instead of going to the police, your character decides to take matters into her own hands. Now, this could be a crime mystery story. You could think about what would happen. What would she do? The next one could be a fantasy story. 3 sisters are fighting with each other to be the next queen of their kingdom. Who will win? This fits very nicely into folk tale, into fantasy, into fairy story, any of these things. Now, when you're writing your story, you're going to need to create characters, of course. Who is the protagonist? Now, in the story, the little story I showed you written by the 8-year-old grandchild, the protagonist is a girl called Bob. That's the main character. Who are the other characters? Now, in the first story that I showed you at the beginning, the other characters, there's only one other character. It's the scallywag. That character is also the antagonist, the character who opposes or fights or has some sort of situation with the protagonist. What is the setting of your story? You have to create a setting. Where is your story set? Is it in a village? Is it in a city? Is it by the sea? Is it somewhere else? In the Bob story at the beginning, it was set in Tasmania, which is a state in Australia. It's in a little cottage. So she makes a very clear setting. Even though it's a very simple child story, there's a very clear setting. When is your story set? Is it in a time long ago? Is it in our world today? You need to think, what is your setting? Where and when? Now, you also need to create conflict. Can you imagine watching a movie or reading a story and there's no conflict or tension? That would be very boring, right? So conflict is the action that drives the story's plot. So conflict is the obstacle or difficulty that the protagonist, the main character, must overcome, or it could be the goal that they're attempting to reach. But in this Bob story, the conflict happens when Bob's just in the little cottage. We know she's 8 years old. We know she's in Tasmania, and then we hear the knock on the door. And the knock on the door, we're like, oh, what is that? Then there's a creak, the door opens. That's the conflict. That's the moment where we go, oh, what's going to happen in this story? So even in a very simple child story, there can be that moment of conflict. So think about what yours is going to be. Of course, the story will need a resolution. A resolution is when everything is kind of brought together, and that's usually just towards the end. So what happens to the characters when their conflict is resolved? Now, in the Bob story, it's written by a young child. So she says Bob and the scallywag just ran off. And we don't know really where they run to or anything, but it kind of ends in a bit of a horror way, like a bit like they've run off and we're never seen again. I think she says they were never seen again, which means that what's happened? Where are they gone? And so the conflict is a bit frightening in that one, and we're not sure what's going on. But it's still got it's got a reasonably solid ending that they've just run away. But your story could have something like, are they able to finally achieve something? Do they learn an important lesson? How do your characters feel at the end of the story? How does the main protagonist feel at the end of the story? Happy, sad, angry? Have they just run away? What has happened? So we need to have a resolution and ending to the story. So now here is the exciting part. And the reason we're doing this whole activity is because we're going to take a few weeks. You can be sending things backwards and forwards to me for a few weeks, because we're going to write and we are going to publish our stories. Publish means to make it public. That means we're going to put the stories out there for other people to read, to share the stories. So you need to know what the steps of a writing cycle are. That cycle is going to take us a few weeks. First thing, we're going to do some planning. What is the genre of your story? Plan the elements of your story, the plot, the character, the setting, the theme, the conflict, the point of view. Is it, think about all of these things in that planning time. You might want to scribble some things down on paper or just think about them in your head. Next. Then the drafting. This is the most important part, I think, for writing, for writers. You start to write your story. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be quite messy, but you need to get your ideas written down in a structured way. You might only do one draft, and then your next one might be exactly what you want. You might have to do 3 or 4 drafts. We don't know. Sometimes when I'm writing, I might do, if it's a poem, I could do 10 drafts. But I think for this purpose, let's start with, hoping that we do 1, 2, or 3 drafts. But you have to start writing. Then we do some revising. So you look over what you've written. Make sure that you think, okay, it makes sense. It's in a logical order. And then you can send it to me, because I'm going to be your extra editor, right? So you send it to me, Nikki, to look over the writing. and you see, and I will see if there are any problems or errors, mistakes with your punctuation or your spelling, or if I think, oh, I don't think this makes sense, I can let you know. Then you must make the necessary improvements, and then you send it back to me to look at, right? And that's part of the drafting, revising process. Then we do some editing. So after you send it back to me, I go, that's okay. Maybe you need to do a bit more here, there. You might do a little bit more. Sometimes we call that editing or polishing the piece. That means you're polishing it. You're going to make this piece of writing shine and beautiful for the reader. So you need to make sure that, all the obvious technical things are correct, the spelling, the punctuation, the grammar, and all of the other little corrections. And then you send that back to me. I check it again. And that might happen more than one time. But once it is correct and ready to be published, and I think this looks perfect, this is good, I like this, I will let you know. And then once that's done, we're going to publish it. And you've done it. Your story is ready to be shared and published on our website. So you need to give yourself a big pat on the back. Well done for all of you. I think that is going to be just fantastic when that moment happens for us all. And then we can have a lovely published selection of stories or collection of stories on our website. So that's the lesson for today. I hope that that's made sense to you. Use that little story written by the child, the little child story at the beginning, to help you to think about what is her plot. What is happening in the story? Who are the characters? What is the conflict? It's a very tiny, simple story. You, of course, are going to write a much more interesting story, but it does have all the elements. Also, when you're writing your story, think about the drafting and the revising and the editing process really well, the planning, because we hope that we're going to get a whole collection of beautiful, interesting, different stories from you. And remember, it is okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are fine. And that's what we're going to learn from. No one is punishing anyone for mistakes in these classes. This is the safe learning forum. I'm learning from you, you're learning from me. We're in this learning, teaching world. So that's what we should be feeling very comfortable and confident about sharing our work. What I'm hoping for after this is that we're going to share a few folk tales. If we don't have any folk tales to share, which I hope we do, then what we're going to do is we'll have a little conversation about this project of writing and publishing our stories in the discussion that we're going to do after the video. Thank you so much for listening to me again. And I'm really looking forward, and I'm really excited about this project with all of you.